The courtroom air was heavy, thick with murmured conversations and the faint shuffle of paper. The judge adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, his voice cutting the room into silence. "State your name for the record." At the defense table, an old man in an orange jumpsuit raised his head. His beard was a wild silver tangle. His hands, cuffed in front of him, trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from years of cold nights and harder days. His voice was rough, worn like an old leather jacket. "Thomas Granger, Sergeant, United States Army, retired." For a moment, everything froze. The bailiff, the prosecutor, even the court reporter, each shifted, a subtle ripple of recognition or perhaps discomfort. Before anyone could process the weight of his words, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. The sound was enough to draw every gaze. Through the entrance marched a figure in full dress uniform, a 4-star general, the stars gleaming under the fluorescent lights, like a silent declaration of authority. The general's steps were deliberate, measured, as if every movement carried the weight of the nation itself. No one remained seated. Police officers, court clerks, even the most jaded lawyers rose instinctively, muscle memory taking over. Only Thomas remained seated, staring blankly ahead, unaware of the shift he had just caused. A cold wind pressed against the courthouse windows. Outside, snow flurried against the glass, just as it had the night Thomas was arrested. 3 days earlier, that same snow had crept through the cracks of a crumbling underpass where Thomas made his shelter. Old plastic tarps, frayed rope, a battered sleeping bag, all that separated him from the icy fingers of winter. At 68, every joint ached. His right knee, shattered by a roadside bomb decades ago, burned with each attempt to shift positions. He barely noticed anymore. Around him, the city bustled in oblivion. People hurried past, bundled in thick coats, carrying coffee cups, talking into their phones. No one saw the man crouched beneath the shadows. But Thomas still saw. He saw the teenage girl who gave her sandwich to a thinner boy by the bus stop. He saw the veteran 3 tents down, coughing blood into a rag. He saw the humanity in a world that often forgot its own heart. Somewhere deep inside, a piece of him remained intact. The part that once wore the uniform not for glory, but because he believed service mattered, even when nobody was watching, especially then. Back in the courtroom, the general stopped at the first row of benches. He removed his cap, holding it against his chest, his expression unreadable. Judge Harrow glanced at the defense attorney, the prosecutor, then back at Thomas. "I understand we have new developments." The general nodded once. Thomas didn't look up. He sat motionless, the weight of the years pressing him into the worn oak of the defendant's chair. He didn't know that today, in a way words could never capture, the world would finally see him again. Not as a vagrant, not as a case number, but as something much more enduring. A man who never surrendered his dignity, even when everything else was stripped away. The night the city swallowed Thomas Granger whole, the wind screamed louder than the sirens. Temperatures had dropped below zero, painting the sidewalks with a thin crust of ice. Storefronts were locked, heaters hummed behind sealed windows, and in the forgotten cracks of the city, people like Thomas fought to exist one more night. His shelter under the overpass had collapsed with the first heavy snowfall. The battered tarps, the worn sleeping bag, the carefully layered newspapers, all crushed under the weight of winter's indifference. Thomas had nowhere left to go. His hands, once steady enough to dismantle explosives, now fumbled against the frozen air as he clutched a thin army jacket closer to his body. The ache in his knee pulsed with every staggering step. He thought about the others. The old Navy man he'd seen 2 nights ago coughing blood in an alley. The woman who hadn't moved from her blanket for hours that morning. People were dying, and no one noticed. At the edge of the industrial district, past abandoned warehouses and rusted shipping containers, Thomas spotted it. An old maintenance garage, long since forgotten, its padlocks rusted, windows broken. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. The door, swollen by years of rain and neglect, gave way with a sharp crack when he leaned his shoulder into it. Inside, the garage smelled of motor oil and dust. The concrete floor was cold enough to steal the heat straight from your bones. Still, it was 4 walls and a roof. Thomas shuffled toward a corner piled with old tires and splintered crates, settling there to shield himself from the worst of the wind. Under the glow of his dying flashlight, he found an old maintenance blanket, thin, filthy, but better than nothing. He wrapped it around his shoulders and sank to the floor, the cold gnawing at him with patient teeth. For a few moments, he simply breathed. The air hurt going in. The ache in his bones whispered that he might not wake up in the morning. Still, he closed his eyes. The blinding lights came first, then the shouting. "Hands where we can see them!" Startled awake, Thomas struggled to rise, but his knee buckled beneath him. 2 police officers stormed in, flashlights mounted on their weapons, faces taut with suspicion. "Stand up, now!" Thomas tried. God, he tried, but his body refused to obey. Pain exploded through his leg as one officer grabbed his arm roughly, jerking him upright. The other officer barked accusations over the crackle of the police radio, breaking and entering, trespassing on city property, theft, because in his pocket they found the maintenance blanket, property of the city. The cuffs bit into his wrists. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He just stood there, swaying slightly under the weight of exhaustion and humiliation, while the officers cataloged him like another piece of urban debris. "What's your name, old man?" one of them demanded. Thomas straightened as much as he could. His voice was barely a whisper. "Sergeant Thomas Granger, United States Army. Retired." The younger officer smirked. "Yeah? Well, Sergeant, tonight you're just another trespasser." The patrol car door slammed behind him with a final metallic thud. As they drove him downtown, Thomas watched the snow swirling in the streetlights, a silent, indifferent world where men like him simply disappeared. Not with explosions, not with banners or funerals, just a slow erasure, one cold night at a time. The holding cell was small. Concrete walls, a metal bench bolted to the floor, a heavy steel door with a narrow window. Thomas sat hunched against the wall, knees drawn up, the chill of the concrete seeping into his bones. He barely registered the muffled sounds of the courthouse waking up above him, the shuffle of shoes, the sharp voices of guards. Instead, his mind drifted elsewhere, to a different cold, a different night. Kandahar, Afghanistan. Winter, 2004. The desert could freeze your blood at night just as easily as it could bake you alive during the day. Thomas crouched behind a crumbling wall, the distant thunder of mortars rumbling through the dust-choked air. Smoke curled into the starless sky. Civilians screamed somewhere beyond the rubble. Inside a collapsed school building, survivors were trapped. Children, teachers, pinned by broken beams and shattered concrete. Orders were clear. Hold position. Wait for engineering units. Stay safe. But Thomas had never been good at waiting when lives hung in the balance. Without a word, he stripped off excess gear, leaving only his service knife, a small flashlight, and his battered determination. He moved fast, a shadow against the broken streets. The collapsed building groaned with every aftershock. The risk was obvious: secondary explosions, structural collapse, certain death if the wrong step was taken. Inside, a young girl cried out. Thin, ragged, the sound of someone too young to understand fear but old enough to feel it. Thomas squeezed through a jagged gap in the wall, his flashlight slicing through the dust. He found her pinned beneath a metal beam, her leg twisted unnaturally. Her eyes, wide with terror, locked onto his. Without hesitation, he wedged himself beneath the debris, straining with every ounce of strength he had left. Pain seared through his side, old injuries tearing fresh, but the beam shifted just enough. He pulled the girl free, cradling her small frame against his chest. A crack split the ceiling above. No time. He ran. Out into the burning night. The building collapsed behind him with a deafening roar, sending a shockwave of dust and broken stone. Thomas didn't stop until he reached the outer perimeter. He placed the girl into the arms of a medic. She clung to his jacket for a heartbeat, her tiny fingers brushing the faded American flag patch on his shoulder. Then she was gone, swept into the care of others. Thomas staggered back, adrenaline crashing into pain. Later, at the field hospital, they patched the worst of his injuries. Nothing major, they said. A cracked rib, torn ligaments, some new shrapnel in the hip. Another medical recommendation was filed somewhere, another citation lost in the shuffle of 1,000 other acts of wartime courage. Thomas never spoke much about that night, not even when asked. He didn't think heroism should need witnesses. It was enough that the girl lived. Back in the cell, Thomas shifted uncomfortably on the bench, the memory pressing against him like the cold. He wondered if the girl remembered, if she had grown up strong, if she had found a better life, far from the ruins of her childhood. He hoped so. That hope, small, stubborn, was what kept him breathing through nights like this. The door clanged open. A guard gestured brusquely. "Courtroom, let's go." Thomas rose slowly, joints protesting, soul heavier than ever. He didn't expect justice. Not here, not now, not for people like him. The invisible, the expendable. Still, he squared his shoulders as best he could, because dignity, once earned, never truly abandoned a man, even when the world did. The courtroom was unusually full that morning. Reporters clustered behind a roped barrier near the back, adjusting tripods and whispering guesses. Several officers in uniform stood silently along the walls, their posture rigid, their eyes alert. But Thomas Granger knew none of this. He stood once again at the defense table, wrists free now, but his posture still carried the weight of years. His orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame. His eyes were dull with exhaustion. The public defender beside him seemed unusually tense. She shuffled papers without purpose, stole glances toward the rear of the room. Then came the announcement, "All rise." The Honorable Judge Malcolm Hayes presiding. As the judge entered, Thomas rose slowly with the rest of the room. He didn't notice the quiet stir behind him. He didn't see the man in full-dress uniform step through the heavy courtroom doors. Didn't hear the collective intake of breath. Didn't feel the wave of reverence sweep across the room like a silent command. But everyone else did. 4 stars gleamed on the man's shoulders. General Richard Albright, hero of multiple campaigns, chief of joint operations, advisor to presidents. The courtroom stood paralyzed as the general moved forward, flanked by 2 aides, every step deliberate. Even Judge Hayes froze for a second, visibly startled. The general stopped beside the prosecution table, his voice calm, unshaken by the spotlight. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I request to address the bench regarding the defendant." Judge Hayes blinked, adjusting his glasses. "General, Albright, is it?" "Yes, sir. I'm told you flew in overnight from D.C. for this?" "I did." The judge nodded, curiosity now overtaking formality. "Proceed." The general turned, and for the first time, Thomas noticed him. Confusion flickered in his eyes. Recognition didn't come immediately, only the uneasy sense that he was being seen too clearly. The general stepped closer, voice steady but softer now. "Sergeant Granger, do you remember al-Shurta, Kandahar, January 2004? A silence fell over the room. Thomas blinked, his lips parted slightly, searching backward in time. "The school," he said finally. "There was a girl. Fires. Traps set in the rubble. That girl was my daughter," the general said. A whisper ran through the crowd. Even the court reporter lowered her hands from the keyboard. "You carried her out yourself, against orders, with a broken hip and open wounds. You never gave your name. You disappeared before anyone could thank you. But I never forgot." Thomas said nothing. His hand gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. "It took me years to track you down," the general continued, turning to face the judge now. "I bring with me certified documentation from the Department of Defense confirming Sergeant Granger's record, his awards, his deployments, his injuries, including 3 citations that were never processed correctly." The general handed over a thick folder, neatly compiled. "Furthermore," he said, "I have confirmation from the Department of Urban Development that the building in question was officially condemned. The items inside were declared surplus. No theft occurred." Gasps echoed faintly in the room. The prosecutor paled. Judge Hayes flipped through the documents, eyes narrowing as he read, then widening. "Is this signed by the Secretary of Veterans Affairs?" "Yes, sir, along with a formal apology for the mishandling of Sergeant Granger's records." Silence. The kind of silence that feels like a shift in the earth beneath your feet. Judge Hayes closed the folder. "Does the prosecution wish to proceed?" The prosecutor didn't look up. "No, Your Honor. The state moves to dismiss all charges." "Motion granted," said the judge. He turned toward Thomas. "Sergeant Granger, you are free to go, with the full apologies of this court." Still, Thomas didn't move. Not until the general stepped forward once more, removed a small box from his pocket, and opened it gently. Inside, a medal that had never been delivered. "This was approved 20 years ago. It belongs to you." And in front of cameras, officers, and civilians, a 4-star general raised his hand and saluted a homeless man. Thomas, instinct taking over, slowly returned it. His hand trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of finally being seen. 1 week later, Thomas Granger sat by a window that didn't rattle in the wind. The small apartment was warm, not just with heat, but with something harder to describe. Clean walls, a simple bed, a kettle on the stove. On the table beside him lay a manila folder. Inside, documents stamped and signed, confirmation of service, back benefits, medical coverage, retroactive to 2003. He hadn't opened it since they handed it to him. It felt too official, too unreal. He preferred to look out the window. From the 3rd floor of the Veterans Housing Complex, he could see the street where, just weeks ago, he had limped past dumpsters and frozen alleys, invisible to everyone. Now, a local news crew waited respectfully at the corner, hoping for a statement. He wouldn't give one. Thomas never liked speeches. A soft knock on the door broke the silence. When he opened it, a young staff member from the General's Foundation stood smiling, holding a small wooden crate. "This just arrived for you, sir." Thomas nodded and took it inside. He opened the lid carefully. Inside, resting on neatly folded military cloth, was a 1949 mountain sleeping bag, olive green, lined with thick wool, stamped with an old U.S. Army insignia. There was a handwritten note tucked into the corner. "The one you lost. Found it in storage, buried under a pile of winter gear. Figured it had waited long enough. R.A." Thomas ran a hand over the fabric. It felt exactly like memory. That afternoon, he walked a few blocks to a quiet corner of the city. There stood a plaque newly installed by the Foundation, Veterans Resource and Shelter Center, in honor of quiet courage. Below the inscription, his name had been added in small engraved letters. Sergeant Thomas Granger, U.S. Army, Reti. He said nothing. Didn't pose for photos. Didn't thank the cameras. Didn't explain the tears quietly forming in his eyes. Instead, he stepped inside. The building buzzed softly with voices. Volunteers sorting supplies, counselors speaking gently with new arrivals, the clink of coffee cups being set on tables. He placed the sleeping bag, his sleeping bag, in the donation bin near the entrance. One of the volunteers, confused, started to speak. Thomas raised a hand, shaking his head. "Someone out there needs it more." Then he turned and walked out, his coat zipped tight against the cold. That night, the snow returned. It drifted slowly, like memory settling on old rooftops. Thomas sat by the window, a cup of tea in his hands, steam rising gently toward the ceiling. On the table beside him rested 2 photographs. One, a faded image of a little Afghan girl wrapped in a thermal blanket, flashing a shy smile from a field hospital bed. The other, General Albright, years older now, standing beside Thomas just days earlier, both men upright, hands clasped, the weight of unspoken history between them. Beside the photos was a folded letter. Neatly written, firm hand. "You once walked through fire to save someone you didn't know. You never asked for thanks, but some of us never forgot. Welcome home, Sergeant. This time we stand with you." Thomas didn't move for a long while. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. The world kept spinning. But in that apartment, a man once discarded by the world felt something settle inside him. A quiet return, not to glory, but to place. He was warm, he was seen, and finally, he was remembered.